Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name's Rachel South, and I manage the bookshop at Pushkin House, and I'm so pleased to welcome Robert Chandler and George Szirtes for tonight's event. So I'm just going to say a couple of words about Robert and George, and then we can get started. So Robert is one of the most eminent translators of Russian language literature into English, including works by Pushkin, Hamid Ismailov, Vasily Grossman, Teffy, and Andrei Platonov. He is also the editor and co-translator of the Penguin Anthology of Russian Poetry. Robert's a longtime friend of Pushkin House, and we've been lucky enough to host already this year 2 of his new translations of Andrei Platonov's Chevengor and Teffy's And Time Was No More. So it's really nice to see you again, Robert. George Szirtes is a poet and translator from Hungarian into English. He has authored many award-winning collections of poetry in English and is the Man Booker International winner in 2015 as the translator of Laszlo Krasnohorke's book, The Melancholy of Resistance. George was on the advisory panel of the British Centre for Literary Translation and of the Poetry Book Society, and today he is on the editorial board of Poems on the Underground, of which I'm sure many of us are familiar, which included Robert's translation of one of Apollinaire's poems, Caterpillar. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Robert and George, and I look forward to the event.
So, very glad to see you all here. There are several of you have contributed to this book in one way or another. David Black in the front row and Peter Daniels. And George actually played a bigger part than he knows, because some time ago, well, this was our first little collection of Apollinaire, and then a long time ago. And then I'd been trying to persuade Adam Freudenheim at Pushkin Press to do a joint volume of Apollinaire and Khlebnikov, and he kept saying he needed more time to think about it, and I had lots of other things to do, so I was being rather desultory about trying to persuade him. And it was actually when, to my great delight, George chose this poem for Poems on the Underground, or he was instrumental. He was one of the people who chose it. And that somehow sort of filled me with boldness to send another email to Adam and say, look, I'm sure if we could just spend half an hour having coffee together, I could convince you that this is worth doing. And we did have coffee together for half an hour, and he agreed. So thank you, George. You played an additional part in this book. And George has also contributed a few of his bestiary poems to this book. I don't want to say a great deal specifically about Apollinaire and Khlebnikov, because I can't say very much that I haven't already said in the book. But I will put more of an emphasis on sort of how the book came into being. Apollinaire was someone who was very involved in all the arts. He had a great many, well, I mean, he knew all the main artists in Paris at his time. He may not have actually known so many composers, but a great many composers did very good settings of his poems. And it was actually during a concert when, what's his name? The quite well-known 20th century French composer who did Poulenc, did setting. So I was listening to some settings of Apollinaire's bestiary poems during a concert, and I was quite struck by these poems, which I hadn't known before. And I think I began translating one of them either during the interval or probably during the concert itself. So think this is the germ of the book. So it's carp, as in the fish. You live longer than we do in your lake in the park. Has death forgotten you, O melancholy carp? And would you like to read some of the bestiary poems?
Yes, certainly. It's an honor to be standing next to Robert, whose work I've known for a very long time. And we were just remembering, or I was remembering, and then Robert remembered too, that a very long time ago, the last millennium, in fact, he was on a course that I had the cheek to teach. And he was translating from ancient Greek, which I don't speak, so my role in his week was fairly minimal. But of course, I've known his other translations for a long time. What I'll do is, yes, I'll read a few of these. So we kind of agreed I would read a few of these very short bestiary poems. I love bestiaries, and I've enjoyed writing bestiaries when the occasion has arisen. They're usually tiny poems, and these are little rhymed quatrains, which he's done rather beautifully. So, mice. O mice of time, brief day by day, you slyly gnaw my life away. And all too soon, I'll have misspent 28 years, I'm sad to say. Caterpillar, of which you caught a glimpse. And I like this one particularly. Work hard, poets. Work with good cheer. Work leads to wealth and freedom from fear. And butterflies, for all their graces, are merely caterpillars who persevere. And cricket? This is the slender cricket St. John once used to eat. May my verses be like it and feed the true elite. Shall I read my one?
Yes.
Okay, I'll do that. This is stag beetle. Horned demon, stag beetle, half insect, half Swiss Army knife. Your armor seems impregnable. Have you come to take my life? Back to you, Robert.
And just one more bestiary poem, which I never quite know why, but particularly appeals to my wife. Jellyfish, floppy heads, violet hairdo, but they enjoy a tempest as much as I do. So one of the similarities between Apollinaire and Khlebnikov is that they both actually began their public careers with kind of bestiaries. Khlebnikov's is somewhat different. It's a kind of long, almost a prose poem, and the images are stranger than Apollinaire's. So Apollinaire's is more formal in terms of rhyme. Khlebnikov's is kind of weirder and more idiosyncratic. But it is very funny and very unusual and interesting. And George is going to read a page of it, the first page, yeah?
First page of?
Zoo.
Zoo. Oh,
yes.
I was going to do that, was I?
That's what I think we said, if you're happy still.
I'm very happy to read it. I've got to find it first. Can you remember what page it is?
It'll be fairly early. Page 33.
Not 33. 30. Forgive me for this. I didn't think this was what we had written to each other. But as soon as I find it, I promise to read it. Ah. Zoo, 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 where the iron bars are like a father reminding his sons that they are brothers and so preventing a bloody battle, where Germans come to drink beer and beauties sell their bodies, where eagles sit like eternity in the guise of a present day yet to reach evening, where the camel, whose great hump has no rider, knows the enigma of Buddhism and conceals the smirk of China, where a deer is nothing but quivering fear, which flowers like a broad stone, where a people's outfits astonish, where a people go about frowning and downcast, and Germans blossom with health, where the black gaze of the swan, the very picture of winter, but with a yellow-black beak like a small grove in autumn, is a little guarded, mistrustful even of the swan itself. Where the dark blue preencock displays a tail like Siberia seen from the rock of Pavda, when over the green of the forest and the gold left by a wildfire is cast a blue net of clouds, and dips in the ground endow the whole scene with any number of hues, where you feel the urge to seize the lyrebird's tail, pluck the lyre strings, and sing of great Russian exploits, where we clench our fists as if clasping a sword and whisper an oath to defend the Russian breed as the price of life, as the price of death, at any price.
The poem goes on for another 7 or 8 pages. Khlebnikov is a very paradoxical man indeed. In some respects, I mean, his life was quite wild. I mean, sort of, you could say it was a Russian Rambo, but really more extreme even than Rambo. But he also had a kind of, he did have, although everyone has, would be infuriated by his otherworldliness and people who tried to help him with the practical aspects of his life, which he was totally incapable of managing. He did have a sort of down-to-earth streak as well, if that's the right word to say with regard to birds. But he did spend, I think, about 5 months as a young man on a serious ornithological expedition in the Urals. He did really know a lot about birds. His father was also an ornithologist. I've read that there are at least 200 birds mentioned in his poetry. At the same time, he is notorious for his sort of more experimental work, which includes poetry written in the language of birds, which is pretty incomprehensible, but there is some real knowledge informing all that. So both these poets, Apollinaire and Khlebnikov, I feel that they suffer a bit from too much emphasis being put on their experimental and avant-garde and more difficult work. And the later work that they wrote, which is often very, very humane and compassionate and entirely accessible, tends to get a little bit forgotten. So it's another reason for bringing them together. And as I've said, they were both very close to the main visual artists of their respective worlds. And another little sort of seed of this book was my visiting a exhibition in Paris, probably about 10 years ago, about Apollinaire. And it was full of, everybody, all the artists of that time painted portraits of Apollinaire. there were lots of postcards that he and Picasso had exchanged with one another. And it was all very sort of light and charming and really delightful. I mean, Picasso and Apollinaire were very, very close indeed. And Picasso was clearly devastated when Apollinaire died. And I really felt sort of something had gone out of Picasso's life and work with Apollinaire's death. I feel Apollinaire was a kind of equal, his equal, and yet not a rival, because they worked in different fields. And they could make fun of each other, which probably, there probably wasn't anyone else after that who could make fun of Picasso in the same way. So this is an Apollinaire poem that very much fits. I think it probably was inspired by Picasso, but it's a little hard to say because the two of them had very similar interests. So mountebanks, as in clowns. A troop of acrobats and clowns is trailing through the dusty plain, past empty hamlets and grey inns, past garden walls and fields of grain. The children seem to know no fear. Their elders walk behind and dream. Apple and pear will be stripped bare should this troop catch sight of them. They carry weights of every shape and gilded hoops and hefty drums, while two wise friends, a bear, an ape, stretch out a bowl and beg for alms. Two of the artists who were close to Khlebnikov are Pavel Filonov, to my mind the greatest Russian artist of the last century, but all his work practically is in Petersburg and some in Moscow, and so he's less known in the West than he should be. And Vladimir Tatlin, who is a great deal better known in the West. So this is a poem that Khlebnikov wrote, evidently inspired by some of Tatlin's more sort of mechanically orientated constructions. So this is from 1916. Tatlin, stern propeller poet, blade bard, sun trapper, has knotted, hard and fast spiderweb tracts of tackle, knitted knots of power, sure as iron horseshoes. Blind idlers lent second sight, gaze in mute amusement, blind idlers lent second sight, gaze in mute amazement at what his craft reveals. Metal traces of his flighting speak spikily of the unknown. And I think I'll go on now to Apollinaire's most famous poem, Le Pont Mirabeau. As I've said, there are there are many different sides to Apollinaire. Some people revere him for his calligrams, his kind of visual poems. But he has also been described as one of perhaps the last French poet who, a lot of people still know some of his poems by heart. And the poem Mirabeau is probably his best known and most song-like poem. There are two lines which I absolutely love, which I shall read in French, which are just genius. Comme la vie est lente, how slow life is, et comme l'espérance est violente, how violent hope is. So he rhymes vie est lente, life is slow, with violente, violent, and just such a wonderful and unexpected rhyme on the two most important words in the poem. So here it is in English. And there is a recording of this, which you can find online quite easily. I mean, of Apollinaire reading this. Lots of crackle, but his voice is entirely clear. Beneath the pont Mirabeau flows the Seine, and our love too. Must I live through it all again? Joy always followed in the wake of pain. Let night come on, bells end the day. Days pass by, I stay. Stretch out your hands to me and meet my eyes. There lies the Seine. Beneath our bridge of arms she lies, deep river that has heard so many sighs. Let night come on, bells end the day. Days pass by, I stay. Love slips away, the river sings this song. Love slips away. Life is so slow, life is lifelong, and hope is so hot-headed, so headstrong. Let night come on, bells end the day. Days pass by, I stay. Days pass, weeks pass, all to the same refrain. Neither time pass nor loves will come this way again. Beneath the pont Mirabeau flows the Seine. Let night come on, bells end the day. Days pass by, I stay. George, I know that you've done some work with a Russian-speaking friend of yours. You've kind of worked together on some. Yeah. Would you like to talk a bit about that and how you came to do that and what it's meant to you?
Yes, I'm really a Hungarian and English speaker, smatterings of French. I know nothing much more. I certainly don't know Russian. But Veronika Krasnova, who is from Moscow, came to the small town where I live, called Windham, which is just south of Norwich, about 8 miles south. And she was at that stage married to a lecturer in politics. And she was a great lover of poetry, and she still is. And she was interested chiefly at that time in two poets, Pushkin and Mandelstam. And she gave me a very short Mandelstam, which is absolutely full of ambiguities and puns. What are you going to do with this? She said. Well, I produced 7 versions of it, which was cheating. But it's quite a good way of cheating, because it makes a poem very playful. And perhaps what I would say with regard, actually both to Apollinaire and Khlebnikov, is that one, I mean, they're practically contemporaries, aren't they? One's born in 1880, the other in 85, Khlebnikov being a younger, and they died just a few years apart, so they are more or less, and they seem to me in some ways spirits of the age so much of the excitement of it. I mean, there's a freshness about both of them. So they can do a variety of things, and they do. Their poetry can be amusing, it can be deep, it can be mysterious, can explore. And in a way they make well, you must have thought of it, Robert, they make a very good couple, partly because of that. Because in both of them there's a kind of joy and playfulness, as though they knew they were at the beginning of something new. They were at the beginning of modernism, really. Which at that stage hadn't yet turned terribly pure, it hadn't yet turned terribly disciplined. I mean, it was Apollinaire who coined the terms Cubism, Surrealism, Orphism, I don't know what else. So he's involved with everything, and Khlebnikov is involved in everything. But as far as Veronica is concerned, that was the one thing we did. Chiefly because I'm taken up with Hungarian translations from the Hungarian. But she's still around, so more might happen. And one other thing, perhaps. I did also tackle Apollinaire. There's a book somewhere where, I don't know how many poets, 14, 15 poets, were asked to translate Les Fenêtres, the windows. And I did 3 versions of Les Fenêtres. They're in there somewhere. One's kind of ultra-modernist, one's very highly formal, and one's in colour. So that's my association with these two. But I must say, I knew Apollinaire far better, and I knew Khlebnikov and far, far longer. I think I brought this along. This old penguin, Apollinaire, 1963. I must have bought it about 3 or 4 years later. It's still the same edition. It's Oliver Bernard's translations at the time, which are also very nice. So you can kind of fall in love with Apollinaire, and I did then. But I have Robert to thank for Khlebnikov, because the first time I came across life, it's in a penguin book of Russian poetry. So I hadn't read him. I knew nothing very much about him, except that he existed. So it's been a pleasure to make his more detailed acquaintance.
Thank you, George. So there's another aspect of Apollinaire which was particularly important to me, was his war poetry. I felt a little bit diffident about this at first, because there seemed to be a general kind of hostility towards it, a feeling that Apollinaire was kind of frivolous, that his war poetry was somehow frivolous. There is a poem which begins ironically, "Ah, que la guerre est jolie," how pretty war is, but it's fairly obvious that that is intended ironically. But there is a kind of, I think there has been a feeling, perhaps less so now, that in England that all war poetry ought to be in the same tone as Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, and a kind of somewhat disapproval, or Apollinaire just not being taken quite seriously as a war poet, because George used the word explore just now. One of the qualities I really love in Apollinaire is his willingness to explore, whatever is there to be explored. people at war, soldiers at war, felt many, many different things. It wasn't only kind of, the grimness of gas attacks and so on. There was a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning of the war. Apollinaire captures that in his first poems. We also perhaps easily forget that the French were defending their own land. Germany had occupied parts of France. They were defending their land. They weren't just, it was easier for Brits to feel kind of what's the point of this, because they weren't on their own land. So there are all kinds of different moods in Apollinaire's poetry. There is a wonderful pairing of poems, and I'm sure he put the two next to each other in calligram entirely intentionally. There's one which I don't think I will read tonight because it's a little bit long. It's called Wonder of the War, and it's kind of ecstatic, sort of madly ecstatic, evocation of the night sky full of tracer shells and rockets, and they probably weren't that used to fireworks in those days, so it's just Apollinaire marveling at this spectacle. And I have actually read other accounts of, Apollinaire wasn't the only person to be struck by the beauty of all this. But it is immediately followed by what I think is one of Apollinaire's most profound and deeply serious poems, called Exercise, which George will read in a moment. But I'd also just like to mention, this is another of my kind of more vivid recollections of a particular step on the journey. It was, I don't know whether or not David will remember this, but I remember spending quite a long time with my friend, the poet David Black, in our garden, discussing the last two lines of this poem, which seemed particularly difficult to translate. And I don't think we actually kind of succeeded at the time, but somehow in that kind of long dwelling on, what did this really mean? Somehow, I think actually quite soon after David left, it did suddenly sort of begin to find its way into English. The French of these last two lines, it's kind of French at its most sort of hostile to English in a way. The French can tolerate abstract nouns much more happily than we can, and impersonal constructions. So the French is ainsi se prolonge la cèse. So continued the ascesis, so as in the word ascetic, but we don't very often use the word ascesis in English. Ainsi se prolonge la cèse qui les exerçait à mourir. So continued the ascesis which exercised them in dying. So obviously that doesn't work very well translated literally into English. But George volunteered to read the English, so please do.
It occurs to me just as the calligrams, those shaped poems, they were written from the trenches or somewhere close to the trenches, weren't they?
Yes, they were all written during the war.
Yeah, you will probably know these. There's one which I remember, which is in the shape of a star.
Yes.
The evening star, a punctual gem, shines like a Raj's diadem. That's Oliver, which has stuck with me from 50 years. This is much more serious. This is exercise. 4 bombardiers were on their way to a small village in the rear. Layers of dust had turned them grey. They joined up earlier that year. They quietly spoke of other years and gazed at the vast plain ahead. A shell cuffed near the bombardiers. Not one so much as turned his head. Their talk was all of yesterday. Tomorrow seemed a waste of breath. They held to their ascetic way, this constant discipline of death.
Someone else whose help I would like to acknowledge is the late Professor Norma Rinsler, who taught at King's College, and she wrote an excellent article on Apollinaire's war poems, and was probably one of the first English scholars to really take them seriously, and she was very helpful to me looking at the translations, and I think it's in her article that she quoted a remarkably similar passage by Wyndham Lewis. It's not poetry, it's from a memoir he wrote, that Wyndham Lewis, like Apollinaire, he was in the artillery, so Apollinaire later moved into the infantry, but initially he was in the artillery, so a little way back from the front line, not quite so exposed to the worst horrors. And so I'm going to read these 10 lines from Wyndham Lewis. More German batteries were firing now, and a number of shells intercepted us. We met an infantry party coming up, about 10 men, with earthen faces and heads bowed. Their eyes turned inwards, as it seemed, to shut out this too familiar scene. As a shell came rushing down beside them, they did not notice it. There was no sidestepping death if this was where you lived. It was worth our while to prostrate ourselves when death came over near. We might escape in spite of death, but they were its servants. Death would not tolerate that optimistic obeisance from them. It's such a good poem that I would actually like to read it in English as well. 4 bombardiers were on their way to a small village in the rear. Layers of dust had turned them grey. They'd joined up earlier that year. They quietly spoke of other years and gazed at the vast plain ahead. A shell coughed near the bombardiers. Not one so much as turned his head. Their talk was all of yesterday. Tomorrow seemed a waste of breath. They held to their ascetic way, this constant discipline of death. It is perhaps more and more striking how closely those two passages resemble each other. It really does sort of bring home how much they must have, the two writers must have hit on something important. It's a little difficult to sort of move on from there to other aspects of their work. Perhaps I should just say, before going back to something more playful, that another thing these two poets had in common is that they both died excruciatingly young. Apollinaire, just after, I forget, was it just after or just before Armistice Day, from Spanish flu, but also because he'd been greatly weakened by a severe head wound during the war. And Khlebnikov, a few years later, of God knows how many different illnesses, but certainly including typhus and extreme malnutrition. He wrote very, very movingly of the 1921 Volga famine, which he did, experience at first hand. Those are some of his quite long poems. We won't read them now, but the Volga famine was a really, really terrible famine, and Apollinaire does capture it in a writing almost as if from a sort of a slightly dreamy child's perspective, absolutely real, and yet with a sort of kind of hallucinatory quality as well. We have in this anthology we've included, there aren't so very many translations of Khlebnikov by other people, but Peter Daniels, who is here now, did a very beautiful translation of one of Khlebnikov's bird-orientated poems. So if you'd like to come up, and perhaps I should move away from this microphone. You can take my place.
Thank you. This was my only toe dipped in the waters of Khlebnikov, I have to admit. And it arose from a translation week at Arvon, which Sasha Dugdale was one of the tutors of. We weren't all doing Russian by any means, but because I was doing Russian, and she used this as an exercise really for writing with sound, I kind of ran away with it. It has one sort of nonsense word in it, which may or may not be noticeable, and the rest of it is just standard Russian turned into English. It's called Timelings. Where the waxwings once were living, where the quiet pines were waving, flying bywards, lifting skywards, timelings flocking on their way, where the whispering pines were waving, where the songlings' cries were wailing, flying bywards, lifting skywards, timelings flocking on their way. In the wild and jumbled shades, like the murk of ancient days, meeting, circling, tweeting, hurtling, timelings flocking on their way. Timelings flocking on their way, you, my songling and my blave, strum my soul, my drunken soul. In my heart you break your wave. So with ringing, songling, singing, cheer the timelings on their way.
Thank you, Peter. There's a very, very beautiful section in this book, translated by what's that again? Black Paul Schmidt, I think. Schmidt, anyway, who has translated a lot of Khlebnikov. Thank you very much, and please don't hesitate to correct me. So we won't read that now, but I do encourage you to look at that. It's from Khlebnikov's long poem called Zangezi. Khlebnikov's most famous poem, I don't think it's his very greatest, but it's his most famous poem, and it really brought him into the public eye, is called Laugh Chant in English. George will read it in a moment. He will read a translation by Christopher Reed. There are a lot of different translations of the poem around, but Christopher's is the best. And it was just Khlebnikov going to town on Russian prefixes and suffixes, so making any number of making up many different words from the basic Russian root for laughter, which is smiech. And at least one of these words did catch on, so the smiechach as laugher, someone who laughs, I think became the title of a magazine, a literary magazine in Russia. And Khlebnikov writes somewhere about enjoying reading this poem with a 7-year-old boy, and how much they both enjoyed and laughed at it.
Laugh chant. Laugh away, laughing boys. Laugh along, laugh men. So they laugh their large laughter. They laugh aloud laughishly. Laugh and be laughed at. Oh, the laughs of the over-laughed, the laugh fest of laughing stocks. Laugh out up laughingly, the laugh of the laughed laughterers. Laughily, laughterize, laughteroids, laughterines, laugh butts and laughlings. Laugh away, laughing boys. Laugh along, laugh men.
Thank you. You heard that beautifully. Listening to that just now, I actually had the feeling that I preferred it to the Russian, but maybe I need to read the Russian again. So some of Khlebnikov's earlier work, he did get some things seriously wrong. I mean, he was very anti-German and was quite militaristic at the very beginning of the war. This changed with time. He certainly did grasp the seriousness of the war. And he did, he was tremendously, I don't know if he he certainly wouldn't have described himself as a Marxist. He was too much his own man, really, to be a communist. But he did greet the revolution with tremendous enthusiasm. But he did quickly and very boldly write about lots of absolutely taboo things, like the extent to which after the Civil War had supposedly ended, there was a massive peasant rebellion of peasants in the Tambov province, and this was the Red Army was using colossal force to put this down. So Khlebnikov did write several very clear, I suppose you could really say, anarchist statements against such violence, and I think this is where I'd like to end. So there's one longish poem called Chairman of the Cheka, the Cheka being the ancestor, the first incarnation of the KGB. it's an acronym. Cheers for China Comisia. So it's Extraordinary Commission is the literal full translation. George, you said you would read Chairman of the Cheka, and I will read the poem after it. Yes. Yeah.
From Chairman of the Cheka. I was sentenced to death because no record of death sentences could be found in all my files. I proved a poor assistant to death. No counter-signature of mine firmed up others' executions. No stern flourish of my pen shaped a last nail in their coffin.
Thank you. So, an idealized chairman, an ideal chairman of the Cheka, very different to the real ones, and in similar veins. So these are both poems from the last year of his life, when Khlebnikov had a very clear sense of how much and how appallingly had gone wrong. This is called Count Me Out. I would much rather stargaze than sign a death warrant. I would much rather see flowers bow their small heads and whisper, "It's him," as I look round the garden, than see the dark rifles of security guards killing those who want to kill me. That's why I'll never, ever be a ruler. I think that's where we should end the actual reading. So please feel free to ask questions of either of us. Yeah.
Would you like to continue your conversation?
George, is there anything you'd like to say?
I will think while I get this microphone right. How long have you been working at Russian, Robert?
Sorry?
How long have you been working at Russian, translation from Russian? And how did you come to it?
I started learning Russian at school. In the 1960s and 70s, Russian was taught a lot more widely at schools and universities than it is now. I was fortunate to have a very kind and wise and tolerant old emigre as my first teacher. But also there was another teacher, the late Gordon Pirrie, who was primarily a teacher of English. He gave wonderful sessions in sort of close reading of English poetry, which I valued enormously, as did all his pupils. But he did also teach French and Russian. He'd learnt Russian during national service. And he did have an interest in literary translation. And it was actually after he left teaching and he bought a small holding in Wales. He was the first man I ever heard to use the word ecology. He bought a small holding in Wales and farmed there for a while. And while doing that, he did very, very good verse translations of La Fontaine and La Fontaine's Russian equivalent, Krylov, late 18th, early 19th century. And I was very, very glad to finally get those into print. Gordon also died young. And so his translations of La Fontaine, I'm not sure if they're in print any longer, but they were published by Hesperus. And I was very glad to be able to include his probably about a dozen versions of Krylov in what became the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry. So that was my sort of very, very first beginning. And then I read Andrei Platonov for the first time while I was spending a year in the Soviet Union, 1973 to 74. And I was very interested in folk tales at the time, so the very, very first thing that I kind of translated, the first sort of complete thing that I translated on my own initiative, not as a sort of exercise for a teacher, was one of Andrei Platonov's versions of Russian folk tales, a story called No Arms, Bezoruchka, which I just was so moved by that I wanted to.
Did you translate Soul? You
Soul?
did, didn't you? Yeah.
Yes, later, yes.
Yeah, but that's a wonderful, wonderful book. And the only reason they didn't win the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize is because Platonov was dead.
Yes, I do remember. It was. Well, it's very kind of you to remind everyone of that. Soul actually was one of a kind of somewhat bowdlerized version of Soul was in the somewhat censored Soviet edition of Platonov that I read during my year in Voronezh. And I didn't immediately, I can't say I sort of immediately fell in love with it, but I registered that this was something utterly extraordinary and that I should read more of Platonov when I got back to England.
Reminds me, the poem of Mandelstam, translated Veronica, was a short poem called Voronezh.
I know, yes. Voronezh has somehow played an important role, not only in Russian literature, but especially for kind of English scholars and translators. I mean, an extraordinary number of the English, people teaching English at Russian universities, people teaching Russian at English universities spent a year in Voronezh.
I wonder how many people here are Russian speakers or Russian readers. If you are, just put your hand up. Oh, there are quite a few. So, had you all read Khlebnikov some years ago? Were you all aware of his work? It's some yes and some no's. So it's a major introduction. Sorry?
Only later on in life.
Yeah.
During study,
No.
he was very far from study. Mayakovsky was the futurist poet that we were studying.
Uh-huh.
And as far as novelists was concerned, Bulgakov. But Khlebnikov didn't reach.
No, that's interesting. You know, one of my closest school friends, I was at a London grammar school, an ordinary grammar school, but Russian was available. And he did take Russian, and he did study Russian at Manchester, I think. And Veronica was teaching Russian at the UEA. The UEA used to have many more languages which were available. You were there? Was Russian available as a degree then? Yeah, it isn't now. No. There's no language which is available, not even one. There isn't a foreign language degree. there are units you can take, and that is what Veronica is teaching, which people can opt for. So people can opt to do that way, but not as a part of a degree study. Shame, isn't it?
It's worrying. I mean, I remember quite a few years ago, probably things are worse now, but I remember reading statistics about foreign office officials. So if you have a job in an embassy in a foreign country, depending on the level of your job, you're supposed to have such and such a level of knowledge of the relevant language. And I think overall in the world, 40% of our embassy officials had the required degree of knowledge of the relevant language. For Russia, it was about 30%. So it's not the way to conduct foreign affairs.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. I had a question again back about Apollinaire and Khlebnikov. You talked quite a lot about the kind of common themes in their poetry. Do you get a sense as to whether they were familiar with each other's work? I'm assuming they never met, because I don't think either went to the other respective country. But was there any familiarity with either of them, or the other's work?
Khlebnikov would certainly have heard Apollinaire's name. Apollinaire, there is just one, I do mention it somewhere in the book. He does mention having received some, it may have been the appeal, there was a kind of, Khlebnikov and others were involved in, what was the chairman of the committee of the terrestrial globe? Anyway, there was some sort of futurist appeal from the Russian futurists. Certainly did come Apollinaire's way. Apollinaire was certainly Apollinaire, who was at least partly Polish in origin. I mean, he certainly was aware of Eastern European culture more than many of his French contemporaries.
Was Khlebnikov known much outside of Soviet Union? I noticed as I picked up this quotation from Roman Jakobson, who said Khlebnikov, quote, as the greatest world poet of our century. But does it mean that Germans, Poles, or other people, because his life and death are conducted during the Soviet Union, and so I don't know how much the work got abroad.
I mean, the Soviets chose to canonize Mayakovsky, whose poetry is more straightforward, rather than Khlebnikov. Khlebnikov has suffered a bit from sometimes being seen as a kind of poet's poet. That's why I wanted to bring attention to his poems about the Volga famine. I mean, part of the origin of this book, I can say a bit more, is that my first Apollinaire book had been out of print for a long time, and I was eager to find a way of bringing the poems back into print. And Adam Freudenheim of Pushkin Press actually he's fluent in German. Adam is fluent in German. He read a very, very enthusiastic review of a large Khlebnikov collection anthology published in Germany, and so he was wanting to wondering about doing something similar in English, and I said I wasn't up to doing a whole, substantial book about Khlebnikov, that I didn't know enough. But what about doing a short book of the two poets? And there are quite a lot of translations. I have looked at other translations of Khlebnikov. There are quite a lot available in French, but I don't know how much.
Not in English, I don't
No.
think. I was searching for them, but there aren't many.
There is a complete works published by Paul Schmidt. Translated by Paul Schmidt, published by I think it may be the Harvard University Press. It's 3 or 4 volumes, and why don't I read a little bit? Because some of those, they're uneven, but one of them is actually stunningly beautiful. So this is Paul Schmidt's translation from Zangezi, which Khlebnikov himself referred to as a super saga. Some of it is written in entirely straightforward language. Some of it is written in the language of birds. Some is written in the language of stars. So this is a little bit in the same vein as what Peter read earlier. They are the bright blue still land, the sky full of bright blue eye fall, never, never fleeing things, whispering on irrelevant wings, ledgelings in flight, seeking their self-land, flocking through darkness to vanishment. A swelling of heavenly never rings, a swirling of wing-welling over rings. They have flown, fading and groaning, forgetting their getting, their names, unwillingly lulled in their own unwantings. Criers and callers, all whirled into wasteland, earth's own backward, the everlasting ever lost of heaven, into the goneness of here and the notness of now, hovering haveless through star frost and sea spray towards elsewhere. Wayfarers on the evening air, listening like thought secrets, heaven's harriers, these nestlings of nowhere, a lattering flutter of wings in flight to some elsewhere, of ledgelings in flight, seeking their self-land. Hover home, breeder of streaming light, of strange unattainable flutter and fluxion, wing wavers white as drifting down, weary wizards of downward drift, wavering dowers of dawn, river of blue sky stead, weary wings of the dreamstead, broad harmonies of the downstead, barefooted in star clusters, there you died. Heaven hovers in their hair, heaven hovers in their voices, streaking the eastern streams of Everland, They fly away into their neverland with the nevering eyes of earthlings, like notnesses of earth lore. Fleet flight to the blue of heaven, flight fleet into blue hovering. Shrouded in all-knowing sorrow, they fly to the source of pre-knowledge, winglings of nowhere, mouths of now here, winglings of not here, mouths of no there. Heaven hovers in their faces. They are the dwellers in the blue places. High heaven's harriers, a flood of flame, the heavenly fire river over us all, the untamed eyes all vanishing vision, their untamed eyes saying, not here. At which point Zangese's disciples interrupt. Zangese, we want something more down to earth. We've had enough of this sky stuff. Play us a tune we can dance to. You're supposed to be a thinker. Think up some entertainment. Everybody here wants to be entertained. That's the way things are. We've just had a good dinner and we want to relax.
Just to answer your question about translations, George, in Eastern Europe, he certainly, Khlebnikov was known in Czechoslovakia. I read him when I was growing up, and he was translated, I can't remember if it was into Czech or Slovak, and it was no doubt due to Roman Jakobson, who was a professor. He founded a linguistic circle in Prague. He lived there between the revolution and 1939 when he escaped and eventually landed in the US.
When was that?
Sorry?
How long ago was that?
So that was between the 1917 and 1939. So the linguistic circle was in the 20s and 30s.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to Robert and George for being here with us tonight. That was very, very interesting to listen to. And thank you to everyone for joining us. We've got plenty of copies of Birds, Beast and a World Making for sale downstairs, as well as a collection of George's poetry and translations. And our bar will be open next door if you'd like to stay with us for a drink. So thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, all of you. Thank you to everybody who contributed in big or small ways to this book, especially David Black, who contributed poems more to their earlier edition of Apollinaire, but some in this one. And if anyone would like, I have a few spare copies of the Caterpillar poster, so if anyone would like to take one home with them, please do. And the book has received sadly little attention, no reviews yet in any newspapers, so anything any of you can do to help it on its way into the world would be very, very grateful. And thank you very, very much, George, for making the journey here. It's great to see you again.